Hannah had recently moved into her new apartment, an elegant and spacious place that felt like a dream come true. The natural light streamed through the large windows, highlighting the glossy wooden floors and the modern design that had captivated her the moment she first saw it. The apartment felt perfect, a fresh start in her life after months of searching for the right place. She loved every corner of it and spent her days arranging her furniture, decorating the walls, and making it truly her own. But it wasn't long before the beauty of her new home took on a mysterious and unsettling tone. One quiet afternoon, while deep in the midst of cleaning and organizing her new space, Hannah stumbled upon something odd. In the far corner of her living room, behind a heavy antique bookshelf that the previous tenant had left behind, she noticed an unusual groove in the wall. At first, she thought it was just an old architectural feature, but as she leaned closer, she spotted a faint outline, a door, cleverly concealed. Intrigued, she pushed the bookshelf aside with some effort, revealing a hidden entrance. Her heart raced with excitement and curiosity. What could possibly be behind this hidden door? It felt like something out of a mystery novel. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing the cold metal handle. Logic told her she should call the landlord or at least wait to investigate later with someone else. But the allure of the unknown was too strong to resist. She opened the door, and to her astonishment, it led to a steep set of stone steps descending into darkness. The air coming from below was cool and damp, carrying with it a faint earthy smell. A strange uneasiness settled over her, but her curiosity pushed her to continue. Grabbing her phone for light, she began her descent, her footsteps echoing in the confined space as she ventured deeper into the hidden passage. As she walked, the faint sound of her name being called stopped her in her tracks. Hannah, a soft, almost whisper-like voice called out, carrying an eerie familiarity that sent chills down her spine. She froze, her phone's flashlight trembling in her hand as she strained her ears. The voice was distant but unmistakable. It was as if someone, or something, was beckoning her forward. Against her better judgment, she continued, rationalizing that it must be an echo or her imagination playing tricks on her. After all, she was alone, wasn't she? The passageway grew narrower as she moved further in. The walls, damp and rough, seemed to close in around her, and she had to stoop slightly to avoid hitting her head on the low ceiling. Her footsteps stirred up a flurry of small bats, their wings flapping wildly as they flew past her, startling her with every movement. Her heart pounded harder with each step, and yet she couldn't bring herself to turn back. The voice, soft and insistent, continued to call her name, growing louder and more distinct as she pressed on. Suddenly, she saw something dark and looming behind her in the faint glow of her flashlight. Her breath caught in her throat, and she spun around, prepared for the worst. But it was just her shadow, stretched and distorted against the rough walls. She let out a shaky laugh, scolding herself for being so jumpy. But the relief was short-lived. A sharp, distinct whisper broke the silence, "Hannah." The voice was closer now, clearer. It was unmistakably female, and it carried an eerie tone that made her skin crawl. Hannah's pace quickened, both out of fear and the inexplicable urge to find the source of the voice. She felt as though she was being pulled forward, compelled to uncover the secret hidden in the depths of the passageway. The bats grew more numerous, their wings brushing against her as they darted about in panic. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, but still, she pressed on, her flashlight cutting through the oppressive darkness. As she navigated the passage, her phone buzzed in her hand, the sudden vibration nearly making her drop it. It was her friend, calling from work. Relieved to hear a familiar voice, Hannah quickly answered, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. She told her friend everything, about the hidden door, the underground passage, and the unsettling voice calling her name. Her friend, however, was not amused. She immediately urged Hannah to get out of there, warning her that it was dangerous to keep going. "You don't know what's down there, Hannah," her friend said, her tone filled with concern. "Please, just leave." Whatever it is, it's not worth the risk. But Hannah couldn't bring herself to turn back. She was so close now, she could feel it. The voice was clearer, almost tangible, and it seemed to be coming from just around the next corner. Hannah ignored her friend's pleas and kept moving forward. The voice was impossibly close now, almost as if it was whispering directly into her ear. Her heart pounded as she turned another corner, the narrow passage opening up into a larger chamber. Then it happened. A blood-curdling scream tore from Hannah's throat, loud enough to make her friend yell into the phone, "Hannah! What happened? Are you okay? Talk to me." But there was no reply. The line was eerily silent except for her friend's frantic shouts. "Hannah! Answer me! Please," she cried. But Hannah's voice never came back. On the cold and eerie night of Saturday, November 18, 2023, Jessica found herself staying in a hotel that, from the very beginning, gave her an unsettling feeling she couldn't quite explain. The dimly lit hallways, the faint musty smell lingering in the air, and the peculiar silence of the building, occasionally broken by inexplicable creaks and thuds, had already set her nerves on edge. However, as the hours dragged on and she sat alone in her room trying to relax, the strange and unnerving sensations only grew worse. At first, it was just small noises, soft whispers she could barely catch, the faint sound of shuffling feet outside her door, and distant, muffled screams that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the walls of the hotel. Jessica tried to convince herself that she was imagining things, that her mind was playing tricks on her after a stressful day of travel. But as the night wore on, the noises became louder, more distinct, and more horrifying, until it felt as though they were coming from inside the very room she occupied. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on her, making her chest feel tight and her breath shallow. She knew in her gut that something wasn't right, that this wasn't just her imagination running wild. Unable to bear the eerie sounds any longer, Jessica grabbed her phone and stepped outside the room, her heart racing as she scanned the dimly lit hallway for any signs of life. She managed to flag down one of the hotel employees, a middle-aged man who appeared to be just as worn out as the building itself, and explained her terrifying predicament. She described the strange noises, the chilling screams, and the overwhelming sense of dread she felt in the room. However, much to her dismay, the employee simply brushed off her concerns with an indifferent wave of his hand, dismissing her fears as nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination. "There's nothing wrong with the room, ma'am," he said, his tone flat and unconvincing. "It's probably just the old pipes or the wind. This hotel is old, it makes noises sometimes. Try to get some rest." Jessica stared at him, desperate for him to take her seriously, but his weary expression and nonchalant attitude told her that she wasn't going to get any help from him. Reluctantly, she returned to her room, her anxiety growing with every step as she closed the door behind her. As she stood alone in the room, the door now shut, Jessica felt a deep sense of unease settling over her like a suffocating blanket. The dim light cast long, sinister shadows on the walls, and every creak of the floorboards made her flinch. Deep down, she knew that the employee's dismissal of her fears wasn't right. This wasn't just her imagination, and the noises she'd been hearing weren't something she could easily explain away. The air felt heavier, colder, and more oppressive, as though the room itself was alive and aware of her presence. Jessica tried to push the fear to the back of her mind, convincing herself that if she could just make it through the night, morning would come, and she could leave the hotel as quickly as possible. She forced herself to lie down on the bed, pulling the covers tightly around her, and closed her eyes, praying for sleep to overtake her and bring her some relief from the creeping terror that gnawed at her every nerve. But no matter how hard she tried, sleep eluded her, and the noises continued, relentless and haunting, piercing the silence and making her skin crawl. As she lay there, staring at the ceiling, her heart pounding with every unexplainable sound, Jessica's eyes were drawn to something strange on the wall across from her bed. In the dim light, it looked like a dark, smudged shape, almost like a stain, but as she squinted to get a better look, the shape began to take on a more defined form. Her breath caught in her throat, and with trembling hands, she reached for the bedside lamp, switching it on. The sudden light flooded the room, illuminating everything, and that's when she saw it clearly, a message scrawled on the wall in what appeared to be blood. The words, dripping and smeared, read, "Help me." Jessica's blood ran cold, and she felt an icy chill race down her spine as she stared at the horrifying message. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The wall had been completely clean when she checked in, she was sure of it. There was no way this writing had been there before, no way it could have gone unnoticed. The implications were clear: someone, or something, had been in the room with her, and they had left this message. Panic surged through Jessica's veins as the realization hit her. She was not alone. Something malevolent was in the room, and it wanted her to know it. Without wasting another second, she leapt out of bed and rushed to the door, her trembling hands fumbling with the lock as she tried to open it. But no matter how hard she turned the key or jiggled the handle, the door refused to budge. It was as if it had been sealed shut, trapping her inside with whatever was lurking in the shadows. Desperation took over, and Jessica began banging on the door, yelling for help, hoping that someone in the hallway or another guest would hear her cries and come to her rescue. But the hallway remained eerily silent, and no one came. Her heart raced, and tears welled up in her eyes as she realized just how alone she truly was. And then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the room was plunged into total darkness. The light bulb flickered once, twice, and then died, leaving her in an oppressive, suffocating void of blackness. Jessica stood frozen, her breaths coming in shallow, panicked gasps as her eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the pounding of her own heart in her ears. But then, just as she thought she might pass out from the fear, she saw it, a dark, shadowy figure standing at the far end of the room. It was barely visible, a looming shape that seemed to shift and blend with the darkness, but its presence was undeniable. Jessica's legs felt like they had turned to stone, and her mind screamed at her to move, to run, to do something, anything, but she was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what she was witnessing. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence filled the room with a suffocating, malevolent energy that made Jessica feel as though she was being watched, hunted, and toyed with. In that moment, she knew there was no escape. Whatever had been making the noises, whatever had written the message on the wall, it was here with her now, and it wasn't going to let her go. On a cold November evening, Crestwood High School lay silent and empty, the long hallways dimly lit by flickering lights. The school day was long over, but in every corner of the town, whispers carried a chilling tale. The rumor was as old as the building itself, passed down through generations of students, and tonight it was louder than ever: the school was haunted. Sophie, Claire, Nina, and Maya, a group of close friends, were texting each other about the story. Sophie was the first to bring up the topic, telling the others about the tragic and eerie story of Emily, a former student who met a terrible fate at the school. Emily had been shy and reserved, the kind of girl who could disappear into the crowd. But on one fateful prom night years ago, she decided to confess her feelings to a popular boy she admired. What should have been a sweet moment turned cruel when the boy and his friends mocked her in front of everyone. The humiliation didn't end there. The group had lured Emily to the gym, where things got out of hand. What exactly happened that night was unclear. Some said it was an accident, others whispered it was deliberate. But the end result was the same: Emily died in that gym, and her death was covered up to protect the school's reputation. Before she died, Emily reportedly cursed the building, promising to haunt it forever. Since then, strange occurrences had plagued the school, especially on the anniversary of her death. Claire chimed in, explaining that every year, students claimed to have seen or heard something. Crying in the gym, lockers slamming on their own, whispers calling out to people by name. Just last year, a student swore they saw Emily's ghost walking down the hall after dark. 2 years before that, someone said they felt a cold hand touch their shoulder while studying late in the library. And tonight, November 18th, marked the anniversary of Emily's death. Maya, however, wasn't convinced. She dismissed the story as just another made-up ghost tale designed to scare people. As she texted her friends, she revealed something that made them all freeze: she was still at school. She had detention that evening and was only just finishing up her work. The 3 girls panicked, begging her to leave immediately, but Maya laughed it off. She assured them the school was quiet, normal, and absolutely not haunted. "I've stayed late plenty of times," she said confidently. "Nothing's ever happened." But then, something did. As Maya walked down the hall, she heard it, a faint sound coming from the gym. At first, she thought she was imagining things, but as she listened more closely, it became clear: it was the sound of someone crying. Maya told her friends, and their panic grew. They begged her to ignore it and leave the building. "That's her," they insisted. "That's Emily's ghost. She's trying to lure you in." Maya still wasn't buying it. "It's probably a student who got locked inside by mistake," she reasoned. "I can't just leave if someone actually needs help." Despite their pleas, Maya headed toward the gym, determined to investigate. As she approached, the crying grew louder, more desperate, and she began to feel a chill in the air. When she reached the door, she found it locked. She knocked, calling out, but there was no response. She texted her friends again, telling them what was happening. Sophie, Claire, and Nina were frantic. "Don't open it," they begged. "It's not a real person, it's her." But Maya couldn't bring herself to leave. She thought about the possibility of someone being trapped inside, cold and scared. Her friends continued pleading, reminding her of the story, but she brushed it off. "Ghosts aren't real," she said, more to herself than to them. Taking a deep breath, Maya forced the door open. The crying stopped instantly. The gym was pitch black, the only light coming from the hallway behind her. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. The air was icy, and the room was eerily silent. "Hello?" she called out, her voice echoing. There was no answer. And then, she disappeared. The next day, Sophie, Claire, and Nina were worried sick. Maya hadn't responded to their texts since the night before, and she didn't show up to school. The girls went to the principal to report what happened. The janitor, who locked up the school that night, was questioned. He swore he had checked the entire building before locking the gym and insisted no one was inside. When the school reviewed the security footage, it showed Maya walking down the hallway toward the gym. She stopped at the door, hesitated, and then entered. But after that, she was never seen coming out. The footage ended with the gym door closing behind her, as if she had vanished into thin air. From that day on, the story of Emily's ghost became even scarier. It wasn't just an old legend anymore, it was now something real, something that had taken Maya. Crestwood High became a place filled with fear, and no one could forget what happened that night. Ryan, Jason, and James were best friends who ran a YouTube channel together. Their videos were all about exploring creepy places and doing scary challenges, and their fans loved it. This Halloween, they had a big idea: visit the most haunted house in their town and film everything. Ryan, the leader of the group, was excited and confident. He kept saying this video would get millions of views. Jason, the creative one, came up with a perfect title: Exploring the Most Haunted House in Town on Halloween. James, always the loud and funny one, was sure their viewers would go crazy for this. But there was one person who wasn't excited: Noah. He was their friend but didn't appear on the channel as much. He told them over and over that it was a bad idea. He had read stories about the house. People said it was cursed. Some who went inside disappeared, while others came out different, scared and broken, like they had seen something they couldn't explain. Noah told them all of this, but they just laughed. "It's all just rumors," Ryan said. "People make up ghost stories all the time to scare each other." Jason added, "If anything weird does happen, it'll make the video even better." Viewers love real paranormal stuff. Noah didn't want to argue anymore, but he still had a bad feeling. He decided not to go with them. He stayed home that night, but he couldn't stop thinking about his friends. Something about that house seemed wrong, even from a distance. The three friends arrived at the haunted house around midnight. The place was exactly what they hoped for, big, old, and creepy. It looked like something out of a horror movie. They started filming as soon as they got there. Ryan, holding the camera, whispered into the mic, "All right, guys. We're here. The most haunted house in town. Let's see if the stories are true." Inside, the house was even creepier. The floor creaked with every step, and the air felt heavy, like the house itself was watching them. Bats flew out of a corner, startling all three of them, but Ryan laughed it off. "This is perfect," he said. "People are gonna love this." They explored room after room, pretending to hear footsteps and acting scared for the camera. They knew their fans liked when they seemed genuinely frightened, even if most of it was fake. But as the night went on, strange things started to happen. When they decided they had enough footage, they packed up their gear and headed to the front door. But when Ryan tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. He pushed harder, but the door felt like it was glued shut. Jason grabbed a metal pipe they had found in the basement and tried to break the door down, but it didn't even leave a mark. "What's going on?" James asked, starting to sound nervous. Ryan shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe the door is stuck." "Stuck?" Jason said. "It's like it's part of the wall now." Panic started to creep in, but Ryan tried to stay calm. "Let's try the windows," he suggested. They ran to the nearest window, but it wouldn't open. They tried another and another, but it was the same. Every window was sealed tight. And then they heard it, the whispers. At first, it sounded like wind blowing through the house. But as they stood there, the sound grew louder. It wasn't wind. It was voices. Dozens of them, maybe more, all talking at once, but they couldn't understand what the voices were saying. "What is that?" James whispered, his voice shaking. None of them had an answer. Desperate to find a way out, they decided to split up. Ryan went upstairs, Jason searched the back of the house, and James stayed near the front. Jason didn't get far before he heard the screams. They came from different directions, first from upstairs, then from the front of the house. They were loud and raw, like someone was in pain. Jason froze, his heart racing. "Ryan?" "James," he called, but there was no answer. He ran toward the sound, but when he got to the main hallway, he stopped. Ryan and James were lying on the floor. Their eyes were open, staring at nothing. They weren't moving. Jason dropped to his knees beside them. "Guys? Come on, wake up." He shook them, but it was no use. They were gone. Back at home, Noah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Jason. The messages were frantic. Jason told him they were trapped in the house. He explained about the door, the whispers, and now Ryan and James lying on the floor, dead for no reason he could understand. Noah's stomach turned. He told Jason to stay calm and that he would come over to help. When Noah got to the address, his heart sank. There was no house. He checked the location on his phone 3 times, but all he saw was an empty field. The haunted house, the one his friends had gone into, was gone. He tried calling Jason, Ryan, and James, but none of them picked up. He sent texts, but they went unanswered. It was like his friends had vanished into thin air. In the days that followed, Noah couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. He went back to the field with other people, hoping someone could explain why the house was gone. But no one could. There was no foundation, no debris, nothing to show that a house had ever been there. Ryan, Jason, and James were never seen again. Their channel went silent, their last video unfinished. Paul woke to the sharp, acrid smell of antiseptic mixed with something far more sinister, a pungent, rotting stench that made his stomach churn. Blinking against the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights above, he sat up, his head spinning. The room around him was sterile but decrepit, with rust-streaked surgical tools scattered on a metal tray and yellowing medical posters peeling from the walls. This was unmistakably a hospital. But something was wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, and no voices or footsteps echoed through the hallways. A cold chill ran down his spine as he called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice rang out, sharp and hollow, only to be swallowed by the oppressive silence. He stumbled to his feet, his breathing shallow. How had he gotten here? He rubbed his temples, trying to remember, but his mind was blank. No accident, no illness, he shouldn't be here. The growing sense of dread clawed at his chest. He needed answers, and more importantly, he needed to get out. Paul hurried to the door and peered into the dim hallway. It stretched endlessly in both directions, lit by flickering lights that buzzed faintly. The walls were lined with grime and dark streaks that might have been blood. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the hallway, determined to find an exit. He passed room after identical room, each filled with decaying medical equipment, overturned chairs, and beds with sheets stained yellow and brown. The further he walked, the worse the air smelled, damp and metallic, tinged with rot. The hospital felt alive, like it was breathing around him, the walls closing in as if watching him. At the end of the hall, he found a stairwell. Relief surged through him as he pushed the door open, only to freeze in confusion. The moment he stepped inside, he was back in the same room where he had woken up. "What the?" His voice broke. Paul stumbled back out into the hallway, his heart pounding, and began walking again. Left, then right, down another hallway, past the same flickering lights. He pushed through another set of doors, and once again, he was back in the same room. The bed, the tray, the peeling walls, they were exactly as they had been. Panic took hold. "This can't be real," he whispered to himself. The hospital wasn't just empty, it was trapping him. Desperate, he turned to the windows, hoping to figure out where he was. But every window he approached was coated in thick, black sludge, oozing down the glass like tar. He reached out, but his fingers recoiled at the sticky, cold texture. Through the sludge, he could see nothing but darkness. Paul stepped back, his breathing rapid. The only sound was the buzzing of the lights and his own erratic heartbeat. Then he heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, dragging footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway behind him. Paul froze, his pulse racing as the sound grew louder. He pressed himself against the wall, straining to hear. The steps were uneven, shuffling, and wrong. Not like a person's, they were heavier, like something dragging itself forward with difficulty. Paul peered around the corner, his breath caught in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and hunched, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its pale, gray skin looked like it was sloughing off, revealing patches of raw flesh beneath. Its head was tilted to the side at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if they could be called that, were hollow black voids, absorbing the dim light around them. Paul ducked back behind the wall, his chest heaving. He had to stay quiet, to stay hidden. But as he turned, his elbow struck a tray of surgical tools, sending them clattering to the floor with a deafening crash. The footsteps stopped. Paul's blood turned cold as the sound of sniffing reached his ears, wet, guttural, and unnervingly close. It was coming. Paul dove under the nearest bed, curling himself into a tight ball and holding his breath. The sniffing grew louder, closer, as the creature shuffled into the room. He could see its twisted feet through the gap beneath the bed, mottled and covered in open sores, each step leaving a dark, sticky residue on the floor. He pressed his hand over his mouth, suppressing a gasp as the creature circled the room, sniffing the air. It stopped right next to the bed. The stench was unbearable now, a mix of decay and damp earth, so thick he could taste it. Paul's eyes watered as he tried to stay as still as possible. The creature leaned down, its shadow looming closer, its skeletal fingers brushing the edge of the bed frame. Then, the hand reached under the bed. Paul jerked back as the bony fingers grazed his ankle, but the creature's grip tightened like a vice. He struggled, kicking and clawing at the floor, but the creature was impossibly strong. It yanked him out from under the bed with inhuman force. Paul's screams echoed through the hospital as he was dragged closer to the thing's face. Its black, hollow eyes stared into his, endless and void of humanity. Its jaw opened wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. And then, everything went dark. Bella couldn't shake the uneasy feeling she had as she lay in bed that night, scrolling through her friends' messages. It was supposed to be a carefree evening. Emma, Liam, Chloe, and Ryan were all abuzz with excitement about their planned day at Silver Lake. It was their usual escape from the monotony of life, a chance to relax, laugh, and make memories. But as Bella read their messages, she couldn't help but feel a knot tightening in her stomach. The lake was no ordinary lake. Silver Lake had long been a subject of whispered warnings and sinister rumors. Bella's cousin had once confided in her about a chilling disappearance, a friend who had gone for a swim and never resurfaced. Search parties had scoured the waters for days, yet no body had been found. Bella had tried to tell her friends about these stories, but their replies were filled with skepticism and teasing. "Come on, Bella. Don't ruin the fun," Emma had said with a dismissive smirk emoji. "Ghost stories, really?" Ryan had laughed. The others chimed in with their reassurances and jokes, brushing off Bella's warnings as baseless paranoia. Even Chloe, usually the cautious one, dismissed the stories, calling them parental scare tactics. Bella eventually gave up, realizing her friends were too caught up in their excitement to take her seriously. She decided to stay home. The next morning, the group piled into Emma's car, the excitement palpable as they headed toward the lake. The weather was perfect, sunlight danced on the horizon, promising a warm and carefree day. By the time they arrived, the lake was sparkling like liquid silver, its calm surface reflecting the surrounding trees and sky. It was serene, inviting. Liam unpacked the speaker and blasted music, filling the air with upbeat tunes. Chloe laid out snacks and floaties while Emma and Ryan dove into the water, laughing and splashing each other. The hours passed in a blur of joy and relaxation. They swam, played games, and lounged by the shore, letting the worries of the world melt away. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the water with hues of orange and red, an eerie stillness settled over the lake. The music seemed quieter, the laughter more subdued. "Time to head back," Emma called, shaking water from her hair. "Go ahead," Liam said, reclining on a towel near the water. "I'll catch up. Just want to soak this in a little longer." Reluctantly, the others left him behind, heading toward the cabin they had rented near the shore. Inside, the group dried off and started preparing for dinner. But then, a blood-curdling scream tore through the air, freezing them in place. "What the hell was that?" Ryan whispered, his face pale. "It's Liam," Emma cried, already running toward the lake. When they reached the water, they saw Liam struggling near the center of the lake. His arms flailed as he tried to swim back, but his movements were frantic and disjointed, as if something was dragging him down. "Help me," he screamed, his voice echoing across the darkening water. Without hesitation, Ryan and Chloe dove in. They reached Liam quickly, grabbing his arms and pulling with all their strength. But it was as if the lake itself was fighting them. Liam's body jerked violently, his screams turning to gurgles as he was pulled deeper into the water. Chloe screamed as she felt a sudden, invisible force grip her ankle. "It's pulling me," she cried, thrashing wildly. Ryan tried to hold on to her, but the force was relentless. In moments, Chloe was yanked beneath the surface, her scream swallowed by the water. "Chloe! No!" Ryan shouted, diving after her. Emma stood frozen on the shore, unable to do anything but watch in horror as the lake claimed her friends one by one. Ryan never came back up. The surface of the lake rippled, then went still, as if nothing had happened. Emma stumbled back to the cabin, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. She dialed Bella, her voice shaking with terror. "Bella, you were right. The lake, it's haunted," she managed to say. Bella's heart sank as she heard the panic in Emma's voice. "What happened? Are you okay?" Emma explained everything: Liam's struggle, the invisible force that had pulled Chloe and Ryan under, the stillness of the lake afterward. Bella could hardly believe what she was hearing. "I'm coming to get you," Bella said firmly. "Where are you?" "I'm in the car," Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it won't start. Bella, I'm so scared." By the time Bella arrived at the parking lot near the trailhead, the sun had completely set, leaving the area bathed in darkness. Emma was sitting in the car, her face pale and her clothes soaked. She looked like she had seen a ghost. Bella helped Emma into her car and called the police. When officers arrived, they combed the lake and its surroundings. Divers scoured the water, and searchlights illuminated the area. But just as Bella had warned, there was no trace of Liam, Chloe, or Ryan. The locals weren't surprised when they heard the news. Silver Lake had a reputation, after all. Over the years, many had whispered about the lake's curse, about its eerie ability to claim lives without a trace. Some said it was the spirit of a young girl who had drowned there decades ago, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to disturb her resting place. Others believed the lake itself was alive, a malevolent entity that fed on the living. For Bella and Emma, the horrors of that day never faded. They avoided the lake and its surrounding areas, haunted by the memories of their friends and the sinister force that had taken them. The lake remained calm, its surface unbroken, as if mocking those who dared to question its secrets. And yet, every so often, another disappearance would occur, feeding the lake's dark legend and ensuring that its story was never forgotten. Jake woke with a start, his breath hitching as he stared into the unfamiliar darkness around him. The dense canopy of trees overhead allowed only faint shards of moonlight to filter through, casting eerie shadows that danced across the forest floor. The air was cold and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decay. Jake sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't his room. He stood, disoriented, trying to make sense of his surroundings. Towering trees stretched endlessly in every direction. Panic began to rise as he realized he had no idea where he was, or how he had gotten there. The last thing he remembered was going to bed in his own room. Fumbling in his pocket, he pulled out his phone. The battery icon showed it was half full, but there was no signal. No bars, no connection. Just the blank, taunting absence of a network. Swiping to his notes app, Jake began recording his thoughts, hoping they might help piece things together later. "I woke up in a forest," he typed, his hands trembling. "I don't know where I am or how I got here. The last thing I remember is going to sleep at home." Jake's mind raced as he tried to rationalize the situation. Was this some sort of prank? Had someone drugged him and dumped him here? But who would do that, and why? He scanned the area for clues, his pulse quickening with every passing second. Then he saw it. An old, weathered wooden sign was nailed to a tree ahead of him. Its jagged letters were carved deep into the wood, rough and uneven. Jake approached cautiously, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The sign read, "You can't escape." A chill ran down his spine. He stumbled back, his mind refusing to process the ominous message. "What does that even mean?" he whispered to himself, his voice trembling. Jake decided to test the warning. Picking a random direction, he started walking. The forest was silent except for the crunch of leaves beneath his feet. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as he pressed forward, his muscles aching and his throat dry. Yet no matter how far he walked, the landscape never changed. The same trees loomed around him, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. And then he saw it again. The sign. The same weathered wood, the same jagged letters, "You can't escape." His chest tightened. It wasn't possible. He had walked in a straight line, hadn't he? Jake turned and ran in another direction, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The forest seemed endless, an infinite maze of identical trees and oppressive shadows. But no matter how fast or how far he ran, he always ended up back at the sign. "It's like the forest won't let me leave," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heartbeat. Jake slumped against a tree, exhaustion overtaking him. He stared at the sign, its carved letters mocking him. He needed to think. To remember. The last thing he recalled was the date. "Jessica," he murmured. They had gone out for drinks at a bar, and everything had seemed normal. They laughed, they talked. The night ended with him returning home, taking a shower, and going to bed. That was it. Nothing out of the ordinary. Nothing that could explain this. A sudden rustling broke the silence. Jake froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The sound was faint at first, a soft crunch of leaves somewhere behind him. Slowly, he turned. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the dense trees. Jake squinted, his breath catching in his throat. It was a girl. As she stepped closer, moonlight illuminated her pale face and the flowing white dress she wore. But the dress was soaked in blood, the crimson stains stark against the fabric. Her hair hung in matted strands around her hollow eyes. Jake's blood turned to ice. "Jessica," he whispered. The figure didn't move. She stood there, watching him, her expression unreadable. Jake blinked, and she was gone. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. No. No, this isn't real. It can't be real. The forest seemed to respond to his fear. The trees groaned as if alive, their branches shifting and creaking. Jake's surroundings began to blur, the landscape twisting in impossible ways. The ground beneath his feet felt unsteady, like it might collapse at any moment. "The forest, it's moving," he muttered. The rustling grew louder, coming from all directions now. Shapes moved in the shadows, too quick to see clearly. Jake spun around, his eyes darting from one dark corner to another. His breaths came in shallow gasps as he realized he wasn't alone. He ran. Branches clawed at his face and arms as he sprinted through the trees, the forest seeming to close in around him. The sound of footsteps followed, echoing his own frantic pace. He didn't dare look back. Suddenly, he tripped, sprawling onto the forest floor. Scrambling to his feet, he turned to see what had been chasing him. Nothing. The forest was silent again, the oppressive stillness more terrifying than the noise. Jake's phone vibrated in his pocket. He pulled it out, his hands shaking. The screen was blank. No calls, no messages. Just a notification he hadn't seen before. "Run." The phone slipped from his grasp as the rustling returned, louder this time. Jake backed away, his legs trembling. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching for him like skeletal fingers. And then he saw her again. Jessica stood just a few feet away, her bloody dress swaying in an unseen breeze. Her hollow eyes locked onto his. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Instead, the forest erupted in a deafening roar, a cacophony of snapping branches and howling wind. Jake screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos around him. The forest consumed him. Megan slammed her notebook shut and sighed heavily, her frustration spilling over. Another mountain of math homework from Mr. Carter, her perpetually stern teacher. The man seemed to have an uncanny knack for turning simple equations into personal torment. He must think we're robots, she muttered to herself, then picked up her phone to vent to her best friend, Lila. Their conversation quickly turned into a mix of playful teasing and Megan's complaints about her academic misery. But as Megan let herself relax for a moment, her gaze drifted to the window. Her chest tightened. It was there again. The cat. This wasn't an ordinary stray. Megan had first noticed it 2 weeks ago, and since then, it had become a nightly visitor. The sleek black creature would perch by her window, its wide, gleaming eyes locked onto her as if it were studying her every move. No matter how many times she banged on the glass or even stepped outside to shoo it away, it would vanish into the night, only to return minutes later. She shivered and texted Lila. "There it is again," Megan wrote. "What's there again?" came Lila's quick reply. "That creepy cat. The one I told you about. It keeps coming back, no matter what I do." Lila's responses were casual, brushing off Megan's growing anxiety. "It's just a cat, Megan. Cats are weird. Ignore it." But Megan couldn't ignore it. How could she? There was something deeply unsettling about the creature. It wasn't just its persistence, it was its stare. Those dark, bottomless eyes seemed to see right through her. She barely slept that night. Every time she started to drift off, a faint noise, a soft scratch at the window or a low, almost imperceptible meow, would jolt her awake. Each time, the cat was still there, unmoving, its gaze unwavering. The next morning, Megan woke up exhausted, her nerves frayed. She had no intention of going to school. Instead, she spent the day going door to door in her neighborhood, armed with a photo of the cat she had snapped during one of its nightly visits. "Excuse me," she'd say, her voice trembling. "Is this your cat?" Most of her neighbors gave her confused or dismissive looks. No one recognized the animal. By the time she reached the last house on the street, her hope was nearly gone. It was an old, weathered house, its paint peeling and windows clouded with grime. Megan hesitated before knocking. The door creaked open, revealing a frail elderly woman with sharp, piercing eyes. "Can I help you, dear?" the woman asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Megan held up her phone, showing the picture of the cat. "Do you know whose cat this is? It keeps coming to my window every night." The woman's expression changed instantly. Her face paled, and her eyes widened in what could only be described as fear. She stepped back, her frail hands gripping the edge of the doorframe. "That's not a cat, dear," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's a warning." Megan blinked, stunned. "A warning? What do you mean? What's wrong with it?" But the woman didn't answer. She muttered something under her breath, then quickly shut the door, leaving Megan standing on the porch, confused and more terrified than ever. That night, Megan sat in her room, staring at the window. She wasn't sure what she had expected to find from her neighbors, but the old woman's cryptic words only deepened her fear. As the hours passed, she waited, her heart pounding with each tick of the clock. And then she saw it, the familiar shadow outside her window. The cat was back. Its glowing eyes seemed to pierce the darkness, staring straight into her soul. Megan swallowed hard and grabbed the broom from the corner of her room. She wasn't going to let this thing control her life any longer. With trembling hands, she approached the window and slowly opened it. The cold night air rushed in, making her shiver. The cat didn't move. It just sat there, staring at her. She swung the broom at it, hoping to scare it away, but the cat didn't flinch. It didn't hiss or retreat. It just stood there, its eyes locked onto hers. A chill ran down her spine as she realized something wasn't right. The cat wasn't just an animal. It was something else entirely, something far more terrifying. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that whatever this creature was, it wasn't leaving. Not until it had finished what it had come to do. Emily sat on her bed, staring out the window into the dark expanse of the woods. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it an eerie stillness that seemed to beckon her. For weeks now, she had heard strange noises at night, soft cries, faint and distant, always coming from the same direction. She had tried to ignore them, chalking it up to the wind or an animal, but tonight, it was different. The sound was louder, closer, unmistakably human. It was a cry, a girl's cry, filled with anguish. She couldn't ignore it anymore. Emily slipped on her jacket and grabbed her flashlight. The house was quiet, her family was asleep, oblivious to the pull that the woods had on her. She hesitated briefly at the door, the stories of the cursed forest lingering in her mind. But curiosity outweighed fear. She had to know. The moment she stepped outside, the air felt heavier, colder than it should have been. The crying seemed to grow louder as she moved closer to the woods. With each step, the trees loomed taller, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The beam of her flashlight cut through the darkness, but it did little to dispel the growing sense of unease. The crying continued, drawing her deeper into the forest. It sounded so close now, as though the girl were just beyond the next cluster of trees. Emily's breath quickened. "Hello?" she called out softly, her voice trembling. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" No response. Just the crying. She pushed forward, her flashlight flickering slightly. Then, she saw her. A girl stood in a small clearing, illuminated by the pale moonlight. She was barefoot, her clothes torn and dirty, her long hair hanging limply around her face. She was small, frail-looking, with her head bowed, her face hidden. She didn't move, didn't acknowledge Emily's presence. The crying stopped. Emily hesitated. "Hey," she said softly, stepping closer. "Are you okay? What are you doing out here?" Still, the girl didn't respond. She just stood there, motionless, her face turned downward. Emily's heart pounded. Something about the girl felt wrong. The silence was deafening now, pressing down on her like a weight. She took another step, her flashlight trembling in her hands. "Do you need help?" Emily tried again, her voice barely above a whisper. Slowly, the girl lifted her head. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The girl's face was pale, unnaturally so, like porcelain. But it wasn't her pallor that froze Emily in place, it was her eyes. Or rather, the absence of them. Where her eyes should have been were two empty, black holes, deep and infinite, like voids that seemed to swallow the light. Emily stumbled back, her flashlight dropping to the ground. Her hands flew to her mouth to stifle a scream as the girl's lips curved into a smile, a slow, unnatural grin that stretched too wide, exposing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. The girl tilted her head, her movements jerky and inhuman. Emily wanted to run, but her legs refused to obey. The cold seemed to seep into her bones, rooting her in place. The girl took a step forward, her bare feet silent against the forest floor. Emily finally found her strength. She turned and ran, her heart pounding as adrenaline coursed through her veins. The underbrush clawed at her legs, branches scratching at her arms as she fled. The forest seemed to close in around her, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The crying resumed, louder now, twisted and mocking, following her every step. But it wasn't fast enough. A chill washed over her as she felt cold, bony fingers wrap around her arm. Emily screamed, trying to wrench herself free, but the grip was impossibly strong. The girl yanked her back, her face inches from Emily's, that terrible grin stretching wider. Emily's flashlight lay forgotten on the ground, its beam flickering weakly as the shadows consumed them. Before she could scream again, the girl lunged. Emily felt sharp teeth sink into her neck, a searing pain that spread like fire through her body. She tried to fight, clawing at the girl, but her strength ebbed with every second. The world began to blur, the forest spinning around her as the darkness crept in. The last thing she saw before the blackness consumed her was the girl's face, her grin now stained with crimson, and the faint, echoing sound of that mocking cry. Ava collapsed onto her couch, still reeling from the news at work. After weeks of putting in long hours and going above and beyond, she hadn't gotten the promotion she had worked so hard for. The role had gone to Michelle, someone who barely lifted a finger. Ava's frustration simmered, but another issue had been weighing on her mind for weeks, a mystery she couldn't explain and one she was too afraid to share. Every night, at exactly 3 a.m., her doorbell rang. At first, she thought it was just her imagination. Maybe she was dreaming, or the wiring was faulty. But after a week of hearing the persistent chime at the same time every night, she knew it was real. It wasn't just a figment of her overworked mind. She had spent countless hours tossing and turning in bed, dread pooling in her stomach as she listened to the clock strike 3, knowing what would come next. Determined to get answers, Ava decided to check her doorbell camera. The footage showed nothing. Each time the doorbell rang, the porch remained empty, no movement, no shadows, no sign of anyone at all. The first few nights, she had felt a flutter of hope that maybe tonight would be different, but each time she was met with disappointment. A sense of unease settled over her, escalating with every passing night. The ringing disrupted her sleep, leaving her exhausted and irritable. She considered calling a technician to check the wiring, but couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a technical glitch. Something about the regularity of it, always at 3 a.m., without fail, unnerved her. One evening, as she sat in her living room, her laptop open in front of her and work files scattered across the coffee table, she heard the doorbell ring again. The sound jolted her from her thoughts, her heart racing in response. She glanced at the clock, 3 a.m. It was happening again. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the mouse. Should she check the camera? Or was she better off ignoring it? A flicker of fear passed through her as she imagined what, or who, might be outside. Ultimately, curiosity got the better of her. Ava opened the camera feed, her breath catching as she watched the screen, expecting to see nothing once again. But this time, there was someone there. A little girl stood at the door, her hair hanging limply over her face and her small frame looked fragile in the dim glow of the porch light. The girl didn't move. She simply stared into the camera, unblinking, her presence chilling and surreal. Ava's hands trembled as she watched the screen, unable to look away. Who was this child? Why was she at her door at 3 a.m.? The girl's eyes were wide, seemingly staring right through the camera and into Ava's soul. There was an intensity to her gaze that made Ava's skin crawl. Before Ava could summon the courage to move, the girl turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the streetlights. A shiver ran down Ava's spine. She felt an inexplicable pull, an urge to follow the girl, but fear rooted her to the spot. The next morning, Ava's mind raced as she replayed the events of the night before. She had to know who the girl was. Driven by a mixture of curiosity and dread, Ava decided to ask around the neighborhood. With each knock on a neighbor's door, she felt more anxious, uncertain of what she would discover. She showed the camera footage to her neighbors, asking if they recognized the girl, but no one did, not even the families with children. "Are you sure you didn't just imagine it?" one neighbor asked, chuckling nervously. Feeling hopeless, she knocked on the door of Mrs. Hastings, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. Mrs. Hastings answered the door slowly, her face creased with age and wisdom. Ava could tell from the woman's expression that she was not one to dismiss the strange happenings around them. "Can I help you, dear?" Mrs. Hastings asked, peering at the footage Ava held on her phone. Ava hesitated, her heart pounding. There's something I need to ask you. I'm experiencing something strange at my house." Mrs. Hastings studied the footage carefully, her face growing pale as she watched. "That's Emily," the woman said softly. Ava blinked in confusion. "Who's Emily?" "Emily used to live in your house years ago. She was just a little girl, no older than 8. One night, she was home alone and heard the doorbell ring. Thinking it was her mother, she opened the door. But it wasn't her mother." Ava's heart sank. "What happened to her?" "She disappeared that night," Mrs. Hastings continued, her voice low and filled with sorrow. "They found her body in the woods days later. Since then, every family that's lived in that house has experienced strange occurrences, always beginning with the doorbell ringing at precisely 3 a.m.